Hello, students. I hope you're all doing well and enjoying this online journey. For our revision today, let us take Unit 4.4, which is a poem, The Height of the Ridiculous by Oliver Holmes. Our poem narrates an incident which is described as the height of the ridiculous. Students, the height of something means an extreme example of something. We often hear jokes or quotes like the one that you can see on your screen. What is the height of honesty? Sitting in an examination hall, opening the chit, memorizing the answers, and then writing without seeing the chit. How honest is that? Or sometimes, to give you another example, you may say to a friend, "My friend, it was the height of stupidity to quit the football team." Our poem is entitled The Height of the Ridiculous. When something is ridiculous, it means that it is too funny to be believed. So the title of the poem, The Height of the Ridiculous, means an extreme attempt at humor which is so ridiculous that it ceases to be funny. Let us read the poem together. I wrote some lines once on a time in wondrous merry mood, and thought, as usual, men would say they were exceeding good. They were so queer, so very queer. I laughed as I would die, albeit in the general way, a sober man am I. I called my servant, and he came. How kind it was of him to mind a slender man like me, he of the might limb. "These to the printer," I exclaimed, and in my humorous way, I added, as a trifling jest, "There'll be the devil to pay." He took the paper, and I watched. I saw him peep within. At the first line he read, his face was all upon the grin. He read the next. The grin grew broad and shot from ear to ear. He read the third. A chuckling noise I now began to hear. The fourth, he broke into a roar. The fifth, his waistband split. The sixth, he burst 5 buttons off and tumbled in a fit. 10 days and nights, with sleepless eye, I watched that wretched man. And since, I never dare to write as funny as I can. Let us read the first 2 stanzas again. I wrote some lines once on a time in wondrous merry mood, and thought, as usual, men would say they were exceeding good. They were so queer, so very queer. I laughed as I would die, albeit in the general way, a sober man am I. In the first 2 stanzas, the poet describes an incident in which he tells us he wrote a humorous poem one day when he was in a good, happy mood. And when he read his own poem, he found it exceedingly funny. Although the poet is generally a sober, serious natured man, he laughed uncontrollably when he read his own poem. Students, I'm sure you have guessed by now. The ridiculous element of the poem begins right here. Can you imagine how ridiculous it would be to meet someone who laughs at his own funny poems? We now come to the next section of the poem where we are introduced to the poet's servant. I called my servant and he came. How kind it was of him to mind a slender man like me, he of the might limb. These to the printer, I exclaimed, and in my humorous way, I added, as a trifling jest, there'll be the devil to pay. The poet's servant is a mighty, strong man, while the poet is a man of slender build. The poet gives the manuscript of his poem to his servant to be taken to the printer. Once again, he displays his ridiculous overconfidence when he says, there'll be the devil to pay. He is sure that his poem is going to create a sensation in the literary world. Let us see what the servant does with the poem. He took the paper and I watched and saw him peep within. At the first line he read, his face was all upon the grin. He read the next, the grin grew broad and shot from ear to ear. He read the third, a chuckling noise I now began to hear. The fourth, he broke into a roar. The fifth, his waistband split. The sixth, he burst 5 buttons off and tumbled in a fit. The naughty servant reads the poem, or rather just peeps at it, and the next 3 stanzas describe the servant's exaggerated reaction to the funny poem. He reads just 6 lines and can read no more because he cannot control his laughter. As readers, we are left wondering, after all, what is so funny about the poem written by the poet? The climax comes in the last stanza when, after 10 days of watching the pathetic condition of his servant, who is breathless with laughter, the poet decides firmly that he will never write a humorous poem again. 10 days and nights, with sleepless eye, I watched that wretched man, and since I never dare to write as funny as I can. As readers, we can only guess. What is the real height of the ridiculous? The initial overconfidence of the poet? Or is it the exaggerated reaction of the servant? Or then, is it the extreme decision taken by the poet to never write humorous poetry again? We can only wonder. But children, do you think this poem is really that simple? Let us understand where the true intelligence of the poet and the real beauty of the poem lies. Understanding the poem. What we have here is not just one poem, but a poem within a poem. Now, poem 1, The Height of the Ridiculous, is written by the poet Oliver Holmes. It is printed in our textbook and available for us to read. The poem is a narrative one. It describes an incident which forced the poet to give up writing funny poems. It also describes the extreme reaction of the servant and the poet himself towards the unnamed poem which he has written. And this unnamed poem is poem 2, which is hidden inside poem 1. The unnamed poet is also apparently written by the poet himself, that is by Oliver Holmes. It is not available for us to read, but it is praised so greatly by the poet that we surely desire to read it. We don't even know the subject of this poem, except that it was very funny and it caused both the poet and the servant to laugh uncontrollably. Hence, we can see the creativity and intelligence of poet Oliver Holmes, who has written a poem to describe another poem written by himself. Now, isn't that tricky? And until you watch and read very closely, you will miss the fun. What are the important characteristics of the poem, The Height of the Ridiculous? The poem is full of examples of hyperbole or exaggeration, which describe the ridiculous behavior or exaggerated reaction of the poet and his servant. The poem has an interesting use of climax. The servant's laughter keeps increasing uncontrollably, and all of a sudden, when the reader does not expect it, the poet takes the extreme decision to never write funny poetry again. Thus, the poem ends in an anticlimax. This is the real height of the ridiculous. After all, isn't it ironic that the poet decides never to write funny poetry after he gets the desired reaction from his servant for his poem? Finally, the poem has a simple rhyme scheme and uniform rhythm. You will learn more about this through a video link which is given to you in the PDF file that is posted along with this video. Let us now take a look at some of the interesting poetic devices used in this poem. We begin with alliteration. Look at the lines, "in wondrous merry mood." In this line, the sound is repeated for poetic effect. In another line, he read the next, "the grin grew broad." Here, the gr sound is repeated for poetic effect. Next, we have repetition. Look at the line. "They were so queer, so very queer." The word queer is repeated for poetic effect. And in the line, "and shot from ear to ear," the word ear is repeated for poetic effect. Tautology. Words with the same meaning are used together for poetic effect. "In wondrous merry mood." Here, the words wondrous and merry, having the same meaning, that is happy, are used together for poetic effect. Also, in another line, "and in my humorous way," I added, as a trifling jest. The words humorous and jest, having the same meaning, are used together for poetic effect. Next comes hyperbole. Actually, The whole poem is an exaggerated statement or a hyperbole. However, there are few lines which can be taken as specific examples of hyperbole, wherein the statement is exaggerated for poetic effect. The lines are, I laughed as I would die. The fifth, his waistband split. The sixth, he burst 5 buttons off. Antithesis. Words having opposite meaning are repeated for poetic effect. Look at the line. To mind a slender man like me, he of the might limb. The words slender man and of the might limb, having opposite meanings, are used together for poetic effect. In another line, 10 days and nights with sleepless eye, the words days and nights, having opposite meaning, are used for poetic effect. We now come to onomatopoeia, a word imitating the sound that it represents is used for poetic effect. He read the third, a chuckling noise I now began to hear. The word chuckling, which imitates the sound of soft laughter, is used for poetic effect. Look at the next line. The fourth, he broke into a roar. The word roar, which imitates the sound of loud laughter, is used for poetic effect. Transferred epithet. An adjective is transferred from one noun to another for poetic effect. Look at the line. 10 days and nights with sleepless eye. The adjective sleepless is transferred from the poet to his eye for poetic effect. It is the poet who is sleepless, not his eye. And finally, we come to climax, wherein the lines are arranged in ascending order of importance. A clear example of climax in this poem is seen when the poet describes the reaction of his servant to his poem as the servant's laughter keeps increasing as he reads from the first line to the sixth. With this, we have gone through all the important poetic devices that are used in this poem. I hope you enjoyed reading and understanding this poem. Thank you, children. Please refer to the PDF file that is posted after this video. It has all the notes of the poem, The Height of the Ridiculous. Thank you once again and have a nice day.